The Capitol freezes as Jasmine Crockett confronts Melania Trump face to face. On the screen flashes a contract worth $20 million binding marriage to the presidency. The chamber erupts, the nation gasps, and the fairy tale collapses in real time. Will Jasmine Crockett's evidence end Melania Trump once and for all? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol chamber burned with white light cameras circling like predators. On the screen above the dais glared the title, First Families and Political Contracts. Millions watched live, the silence so sharp it felt like a blade against the throat of the nation. No one shifted. No one dared breathe. Jasmine Crockett sat rigid, her red folder stamped Trump-Nouse Agreement 2015 lying on the desk like a live grenade. Her eyes locked forward, steel in her gaze, the calm of a woman carrying dynamite truth. Every viewer knew she had come not to question but to strike. Opposite her, Melania Trump entered in a flawless white dress. Her face was ice, but her eyes betrayed vigilance alert, defensive, ready for war. This was no porcelain doll. This was a survivor of power storm walking into fire. The question roared, unspoken yet deafening. Was this marriage love or a contract worth millions? The silence in the chamber was suffocating when Jasmine leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Before the campaign, did you or did you not sign a new addendum to your marriage contract? The words cracked through the room, and all eyes snapped toward Melania. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowing with defiance. She shot back immediately, her voice sharp and rising. I do not need to answer a question built on speculation. This is private business, not for public spectacle. The words echoed, icy and defensive, hanging heavy in the air. Jasmine did not flinch. She pressed forward with the calm certainty of a prosecutor tightening a noose. Madam, the United States Congress has every right to examine any agreement if it touches the integrity of the White House. Privacy ends where public accountability begins. Murmurs rippled across the rows of lawmakers, their pens poised, the cameras zooming closer. It felt like the room had tilted, as if something irreversible was about to break open. Then Jasmine moved. With one flick of her hand, the monitors lit up a scanned document appearing larger than life. There it was, the addendum dated 2015, the ink of Melania's signature unmistakable. The chamber stirred alive, gasps, escaping cameras snapping furiously. The image glared down on Melania like a spotlight she could not escape. For a moment she froze, her jaw tightening as though stone. Jasmine rose slightly from her chair, her voice deliberate, savoring every syllable. The spouse agrees to remain in the marriage throughout the duration of Donald J. Trump's presidency. Upon completion of the term, she shall receive an additional compensation of $20 million. Each word landed like a hammer pounding against the silence. Reporters scribbled wildly, senators leaned forward, and the room grew louder with whispers that sounded more like thunder. The strike came. Jasmine slammed the file onto the desk, the crack echoing like a gunshot. You did not sit in the White House out of love. You sat there because of a contract worth $20 million. Deny it if you can. The challenge exploded across the chamber, ricocheting off every wall. For a moment, time seemed to stop. All cameras swung back to Melania, their lenses unblinking, merciless. Melania lifted her chin, her eyes blazing with controlled fury. Every high-profile marriage has protective agreements, she fired back, her accent cutting through the noise. That does not make me a hired actress. I endured storms of public humiliation. I lived under constant attack. That is worth more than any money you claim to wave in my face. Her words, sharp and defiant, crashed into the room with equal force. The chamber erupted, half the audience gasping, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding as if finally hearing a truth they had suspected all along. Senators whispered urgently, reporters mouthed headlines before ink hit their paper, the sound of chaos rising. The clash was no longer just words. It was a battle of survival, a duel between accusation and resistance. And in that storm, the tension did not settle. It only sharpened, pulling every eye closer to the next strike yet to come. The chamber had barely recovered from the first explosion when Jasmine pressed forward, refusing to release her grip. Her voice cut in sharper than before. If this was only about protecting your family, then why was the addendum signed in June 2015, the exact month Donald Trump announced his candidacy? Do you deny it? The words echoed, each syllable stabbing through the silence. All eyes shifted back to Melania, the camera zooming tight, waiting for her to slip. Melania shot her answer fast, her voice clipped and unyielding. Coincidence and timing does not prove connection. I signed because I have the right to be protected. Her tone was firm, almost dismissive, as if daring Jasmine to push harder. But the tightness around her jaw betrayed a flicker of unease, a crack in the porcelain calm she had worn since walking into the chamber. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. She raised another document, her arms steady, her eyes fixed on Melania, like a predator scenting blood. The screen lit again, and the words appeared in bold post-White House settlement. Gasps rolled through the chamber as Jasmine flipped to the crucial paragraph. She read slowly, her voice resonating through the marble hall. The bonus ensures stability of the marital image during the campaign and throughout the presidential term. Each word was like a nail hammered into a coffin. The crowd murmured louder, the implication undeniable. Then Jasmine drove the knife deeper. Madam, this is not protection of a marriage. This is protection of a political image. You were not treated as an equal partner. You were treated as a communications tool. Her tone was clinical, deliberate, yet sharp enough to draw blood. Reporters scribbled furiously, senators exchanged stunned glances. The cameras caught every flicker of Melania's face, magnifying it for millions of viewers at home. Melania leaned forward, her voice low but seething, each word biting with anger. If I were a tool, I would have left long ago. I stayed because of who I am, not because of a piece of paper. Her words cracked like a whip, her accent cutting the silence in half. For a second, her eyes blazed with fury, as if daring Jasmine to contradict her humanity. The chamber buzzed with tension, divided between pity, doubt, and shock. But Jasmine's stare did not waver. She leaned in, her voice forged in steel, her words falling with lethal precision. No one preserves freedom through a contract of purchase. You sold yourself. The final strike landed with brutal force, reverberating through every corner of the hall. The crowd gasped, as if struck themselves, the weight of the accusation pressing down on the air. And just like that, the silence returned, heavier than before, every second a countdown to the next detonation. The next blow came fast. Jasmine pushed the question, her tone relentless. If not for this contract, would you still have been First Lady for those 4 years? The phrasing ricocheted off the marble like a bullet, and the chamber snapped back to silence. From the dais, the chair watched with a locked jaw, unwilling to interrupt the collision already underway. Melania's shoulders tightened, color rising, and her reply came hot. I do not need a contract to be a wife. I was there because I chose to stand by my husband. The force of it drew a collective inhale, but Jasmine didn't blink. She held the pause just long enough to make the air feel dangerous. Then the monitors lit again as Jasmine tapped the console. A file waveform appeared, and a voice everyone recognized filled the room, Michael Cohen. On the audio, he said clear and cold. The addendum was the only way to keep Melania in the campaign, to prevent a public crisis. A shockwave rolled through the crowd. Aides traded looks, reporters raised phones, and committee members leaned in as if dragged by gravity. Jasmine let the line hang, then repeated it, each word measured like evidence, read into the record, the syllables sharp as tacks. Melania stared at the speaker's jaw locked, as if she could force the sound back into the machine. A timestamp burned on the corner of the screen, June 2015, tightening the vice on the timeline everyone already felt. Jasmine pivoted, never taking her eyes off Melania. Her finger leveled like a pointer at a map of fault lines, and her voice rose into the kill zone. You were not the First Lady of the American people. You were the product of a term-limited contract. 4 years of silence and staged smiles, priced at $20 million. The words detonated at once and a roar broke out. Gasps, shouts, the metallic clatter of pens hitting desks, the scrape of chairs. Cameras surged forward. Flashes strobed. The gallery held its breath as if oxygen itself might choose sides. Even the nameplate in front of Melania rattled against the wood. For a beat, everyone waited to see if she would break. The stenographer's keys rattled at a frantic clip, trying to keep pace with the surge of accusation. She didn't break. She struck back. Melania slammed her palm to the table and shouted, "Do not insult me. I know my worth is greater than any sum of money. I sacrificed my private life, my dignity, and my freedom to protect this family. The declaration cracked through the uproar, raw with rage and pride, and the noise collapsed into a tense, brittle hush that magnified every heartbeat. Jasmine leaned in, voice low enough to cut without echo. Sacrifice, no ma'am. That was a transaction. The sentence landed like a closing door, final and cold, and the microphone seemed to flinch. Every lens held still, recording the exact second the room crossed a line it could not ever uncross. The uproar from the last exchange had not even faded when Melania inhaled sharply, her chest rising as if she were drawing in armor. She steadied her hands on the desk, then spoke into the microphone with deliberate control. Every marriage has agreements. Everyone wants security if everything falls apart. Her words rolled slow, heavy, as though she was forcing the chamber to remember that not all contracts are weapons. But the silence that followed was hostile, waiting for Jasmine to rip the reasoning apart. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, her tone hard as steel. Ordinary agreements protect property, but your contract ties itself to a political term. You didn't just sign a prenup, you turned the White House into a trading floor. The strike was brutal, her voice flat, no hesitation. The weight of it lingered like smoke after an explosion, pressing the room into a taut stillness. Senators shifted uneasily and cameras zoomed tighter on Melania's face. Melania gripped the microphone knuckles white, her voice rising with fire. No, I made myself strong enough to survive in power and hatred. Without me, he would have lost everything. Her defiance hit the chamber like a thrown spear, echoing with conviction. She was no longer ice, she was flame, and for the first time the room felt her heat. Reporters scribbled frantically, their pens scratching like sparks in the silence. Jasmine tilted her head, her lips curling into a bitter half-smile. She spoke with quiet venom, the kind that pierced deeper than a shout. If you were truly strong, you would not need a payout to keep silent. The accusation struck like a hammer, direct and merciless. It was not just a question, it was a dismantling, a challenge to her very claim of strength. Melania's face hardened, her eyes burning, but no words came fast enough to close the wound. The chamber exploded. Applause cracked from one side, sharp and furious, while jeers and protests rose from the other. The gallery was split into two roaring currents, clashing in real time, their noise shaking the marble walls. The gavel slammed, but order was gone. This was no longer just a hearing, it was war. And in the center of the storm, the two women locked eyes, unyielding, as if the world itself had shrunk to their battlefield. The roar of the chamber had barely settled when Jasmine reached for the final page. The red folder cracked open again, her fingers steady, her voice low but deadly clear. Here on the last page of the addendum, she held it high, her eyes never leaving Melania, as she read aloud every word like a nail hammered into stone. If the term ends early due to resignation, impeachment, or death, the bonus shall be reduced by half. The words fell into the air like ice water, and instantly the room froze. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out, leaving only the echo of those lines lingering like a curse. The silence thickened heavier than any shout until Jasmine cut it clean with a single strike. Even the political life of the president has been assigned a price tag. This is not marriage, it is a marketplace. And you are the seller. Her voice cracked through the stillness, like thunder shaking the marble walls, slicing every doubt in half. Senators gawked, the press leaned forward, pens clattering against notepads, every camera locked on Melania's face. The shock was no longer about money. It was about a marriage measured against the death of power itself. Melania's cheeks flared red, her composure cracking for the first time under the crushing weight of those words. She snapped forward, her voice rising, trembling with fury. That was a precaution. Everyone wants safety. If my husband fell, I would fall with him. I have the right to be compensated. The defiance burned in her eyes as she clutched the microphone, her knuckles pale against the metal. Her tone carried both anger and desperation, a woman refusing to be caged as a villain when she saw herself as the survivor of an empire. The audience stirred, half nodding, half shaking their heads in disbelief. But Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned in her stare, unflinching, her words sharpened into a blade meant to cut through every layer of defense. No, madam. That was not precaution. That was speculation. And it was speculation paid for by the American people. You didn't guard yourself, you gambled on power. And this country has paid the price. The blow landed like a finishing strike echoing through the chamber. Reporters dropped their pens in shock, senators muttered under their breath, and the gallery erupted into gasps that carried the weight of betrayal. For a long, pulsing moment, Melania said nothing. Her lips trembled, her eyes narrowed, and the fury that had burned so bright now simmered under the crushing weight of Jasmine's words. The tension was unbearable, the chamber itself holding its breath, waiting for either another outburst or the final collapse. And in that silence, the duel between them felt less like politics and more like war. War over truth, over power, over the price of silence itself. The word transaction still hung in the air when the room tilted toward silence, a heavy, breathless quiet that pressed against the ribs. Melania looked down, her hands trembling, but her chin stayed high as if lifted by stubborn pride and years of practiced poise. The gloss of the table held her reflection, eyes wet, jaw tight, composure rebuilt, one measured breath at a time, like scaffolding tightening around a swaying tower. Her diamond clicked softly against the wood, a nervous metronome no camera could miss, ticking out the seconds of exposure. She drew in a slow breath and steadied her shoulders, refusing to let the tremor become a collapse, refusing to feed the waiting wolves. The hush felt electric, like a fuse line waiting for the next spark, a soundless countdown the nation could almost hear. Jasmine gathered the red folder, aligning every edge with surgical care. Before she spoke the ritual of control, before the strike, a calm that looked like mercy but wasn't. Her voice was clear, measured, and final. The American people deserved to know the truth. They did not elect a contract. They elected a family to lead, and what they received was a lie. The line lashed across the chamber, a whip of words that left welts in the quiet, drawing flinches from even the seasoned staffers. A pair of staffers froze mid-stride. A boom mic shivered above the dais. Pens stalled over half-finished notes, ink beating at the tips. The gavel hovered suspended between protocol and panic as the sentence kept ringing like a struck bell that refused to die. Cameras drifted to the living contrast staged across the table lenses, breathing in and out like restless lungs. Jasmine stood straight, shoulders squared, eyes blazing with conviction that dared the backlash to come, her stance the geometry of a verdict. She did not flinch or blink. She offered the lens the stillness of a blade held to a throat, an invitation to test its edge. Opposite her, Melania sat, rigid lips pressed into a pale line, eyes flashing with anger that refused surrender. A fire banked behind glass. The frame cleaved them in two, fire, an ice verdict, and resistance locked together by a storm. Neither would abandon a portrait already writing headlines. The hearing staggered toward its end on a rising tide of whispers that no gavel could stop, a chorus swelling beneath the marble. Breaths turned to murmurs, murmurs into chatter, chatter into a fervor of scraping chairs and urgent stage directions, multiplying in the aisles. Phones lit up like a midnight skyline. Lower thirds flashed in test fonts. Producers hissed for clean shots as security shifted and doors cracked open. The chair finally declared adjournment, but the word drowned under the roll of voices carrying toward the corridors, bouncing off stone like surf. And as the doors opened to the hallway, you could feel the first waves forming, public opinion, gathering speed, ready to break, eager for blood and answers and hard judgment. The gavel strike had barely faded when the story broke loose into the bloodstream of the world. By sunrise, every major outlet screamed the same headline in unison, the words flashing like fire alarms across screens: 20 million marriage deal. The phrase was simple, sharp, unforgettable. In London, commuters froze over tabloids plastered with Jasmine's raised hand and Melania's tight jaw. In Paris, morning anchors spoke with disbelief, their voices rising with a mix of shock and amusement. In Tokyo, the headlines scrolled in neon across Shinjuku towers, the number 20 million glowing like a wound. The scandal was no longer confined to the marble walls of Washington, it was global currency. Within hours, the internet split into factions, each more vicious than the last. On one side were those who called Melania a trapped wife, cornered by politics, bullied into signing paper chains she could never break. They shared clips of her reddened face in the chamber, calling it proof of coercion, of humiliation under the eyes of millions. "She's not guilty," they typed in threads that stretched for miles. "She's collateral damage in his empire." Yet on the other side, the mockery was merciless. Memes of staged smiles filled timelines, captions sneering 20 million reasons to keep quiet. Commentators spat the line with scorn. She sold her silence. She rented her smile. Don't mistake survival for sacrifice. The divide was a fault line, splitting households, splitting feeds, making strangers scream at each other across glowing screens. Primetime shows seized the blood in the water. CNN cut straight to the contract clause displayed in bold letters across the screen. The anchor's voice dripped with severity. If the contract is real, this is a dangerous example of a politician turning family into PR. On the split-screen images rolled of campaign rallies, Melania standing silent at Trump's side while the crowd thundered. The words PR tool sat in the corner of the broadcast, burning like an indictment. Analysts leaned forward, palms flat on desks, explaining that this was not about love or loyalty. It was about optics, stability, brand management. Marriage is image control, one said grimly. This is corporate strategy dressed in bridal white. The lesson cut through the panels with cruel simplicity. Money can build walls, but it cannot silence the truth forever. The higher the payoff, the louder the collapse when the truth escapes. And here it was, splattered across front pages and hashtags, proof that the most private vows of America's first family had been priced, signed, and sealed like a deal at a boardroom table. The public repeated it as if it were gospel. Money cannot bury the truth. Jasmine Crockett became the lightning rod. In editorials, she was praised as the voice of transparency, a lone blade slicing through layers of secrecy. Clips of her final lines went viral, replayed in classrooms, community centers, even late-night comedy. People paused, rewound, watched again, savoring every syllable. They didn't elect a contract. They elected a family. And what they got was a lie. Hashtags bloomed in her name. Truth with Jasmine trending in dozens of cities. For many, she was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a prosecutor for the people, the only one who had dared to hold the red folder to the light. But the legal world was not content with applause. Professors and attorneys crowded the airwaves, dissecting the clause with surgical precision. This is not a standard prenup, one scholar declared, glasses flashing under studio lights. This is an unusual agreement, potentially void for conflict with public interest. Words like unconscionable and contrary to public policy leapt from their mouths, once academic jargon, now front-page ammunition. Law students clipped the broadcast, whispering that this case could end up in textbooks. What once looked like gossip now shimmered as precedent, a test case waiting for a courtroom. The question hung over diners, buses, and family tables. Is there any real family left in politics? The line ran across TV tickers in bold red. At breakfast counters in Ohio, forks paused midair. In Los Angeles cafes, couples debated, voices rising the screen above them, playing Jasmine's cross-examination on loop. On radio stations, callers wept, furious that intimacy had been sold, laughing bitterly that maybe every smile in politics had a price. The hearing was no longer a scandal, it was a mirror, and America was horrified by its own reflection. Melania's image fractured into two battling myths. In one, she was the survivor, a woman armored against a hostile world, her silence proof of endurance rather than greed. In the other, she was complicit, her signature proof of partnership and deceit. Opinion writers clashed, some pitying her as a victim bound by golden chains, others condemning her as a co-conspirator in the selling of trust. The debate never softened. It only sharpened each photo of her face, fueling the arguments, each quote dissected as evidence of guilt or innocence. Jasmine, meanwhile, refused to let the fire cool. Standing at the microphones with the Capitol dome behind her, she spoke with the same clarity that had ignited the chamber. Congress needs laws to stop marriage from being exploited for political ends, she declared. She outlined reforms, mandatory disclosures, conflict of interest reviews, bans on spousal contracts tied to office. The specifics mattered less than the vision. To the crowd of cameras, her words were a call to arms. No more silent deals. No more families turned into props. The press seized the phrase marriage reform, and the two words ricocheted across headlines with the speed of contagion. By nightfall, the scandal was not just news, it was ritual. Late-night shows carved jokes from the most brutal lines, laughter mixing with disbelief. Hashtags spiraled into campaigns. Petitions gathered signatures by the hour. Lawyers prepared statements for the morning shows. Strategists drafted responses that sounded like apologies without admitting guilt. The scandal did not fade, it hardened like lava, turning to glass cold and sharp and permanent. And through it all, one truth pulsed louder than the noise the red folder had torn open, something no one could close again. The world had seen the price tag on love at the highest level of power, and the question refused to die. The hearing may have ended, but its echoes shook the walls of power long after the gavel fell. Within days, Congress announced a new round of hearings under a chilling title that burned across the nation's feeds political marriage transparency. The phrasing alone was enough to ignite tempers. The idea that the most private vow, the bond of marriage, needed oversight like foreign lobbying or corporate funding rattled Americans to their core. Committees drafted subpoenas, staffers whispered about more red folders, and the phrase spread across headlines like a thunderclap. Transparency, once just a political buzzword, now reached into the bedroom of power itself. Publishers moved just as quickly. Manhattan boardrooms glowed under midnight lamps as executives threw numbers on the table. 20 million, 50 million. The highest bids circled one name, Melania Trump. They wanted her voice, her side of the contract, her confession, or her defense. Ghostwriters stood ready, cover concepts already mocked up. One editor said on live TV, her silence could be worth more than her words. But the world soon learned silence wasn't just a choice. The contract bound her lips tighter than any lock. The addendum that had shocked America was also a gag order, ironclad and merciless. She was a prisoner of ink watched by lawyers sharper than any blade. Reporters camped outside her Manhattan residence, but every question bounced off the same wall. No comment. The story became borderless. From BBC in London to NHK in Tokyo, broadcasters looped Jasmine's firebrand line. They did not elect a contract. They elected a family. And what they received was a lie. Translation after translation carried the strike across languages, the phrase echoing in accents from Paris to Sao Paulo. International papers printed side-by-side spreads of Trump Tower and the White House as if to ask, where did the brand end and the presidency begin? Editorial cartoons sketched Melania, with a price tag around her neck, Jasmine wielding the red folder like a sword. In cafes from Berlin to Bangkok, strangers debated whether America had just exposed the biggest illusion of all, that even love at the highest stage was staged. At home, the reaction deepened into something darker. The country stared at itself and asked the question out loud. If even the marriage of the president has a price, then what in this nation is real? It wasn't satire. It was despair. Talk radio rang with voices of every age, some trembling, some raging. Veterans spoke of fighting for honor, now cheapened by contracts. Mothers cried over daughters who asked if marriage was ever more than a transaction. Teachers reported students raising hands in civics classes, demanding to know how democracy could stand, if even a family could be bought. The scandal had become more than a headline. It was a crack in faith itself. And then came the streets. A movement began online with a single post. Give truth back to families and politics. Within hours, it was printed on cardboard signs. By the weekend, it thundered across boulevards in capital cities. Protesters gathered outside courthouses and Capitol steps, their chants echoing into the night. Truth for families. Truth for politics. Some held photographs of their own weddings taped with dollar signs slashed out in red ink. Others wore masks of silence with price tags dangling from their mouths. The message was brutal in its simplicity. America would no longer tolerate love or loyalty packaged and sold as political props. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all. What had begun as one hearing made her a symbol. Editorials painted her as fearless, the woman who stared down power and did not blink. She became the embodiment of resistance to secrecy, her words quoted on protest banners, her face printed on posters alongside the word truth. News anchors marveled at her composure under fire, replaying the exact moment she said, "This is not a marriage. This is a market." On social platforms, young activists adopted her quotes as mottos, branding them into memes and hashtags that spread faster than spin. She was no longer just a congresswoman, she was a cultural weapon. But Jasmine herself refused to play the role of celebrity. At a late-night press conference under a cold spotlight, she said simply, "This isn't about me. It's about the people's right to know." Her refusal to bask in the attention only amplified her stature. Commentators compared her to whistleblowers, to truth-tellers in history who had cracked open systems too powerful to touch. And each time she spoke, she returned to the same refrain: silence has a price. But truth has value beyond measure. The debate around her drew sharper teeth. Supporters called her a hero, critics accused her of spectacle, but even her enemies admitted she had detonated something irreversible. No one could pretend anymore that marriage in politics was untouchable. The hearings forced America to see what it had never wanted to see: intimacy reduced to negotiation affection, packaged as strategy, loyalty secured with payouts. The lie was naked, and the lie could not be redressed. And so the final words began to crystallize, whispered first by activists, then shouted by crowds, then printed in editorials as a closing verdict. The message was universal, unshakable, and written like law in the air. Love cannot be turned into a political term limit. Marriage cannot be bought and sold through political contracts. Democracy can only survive when truth is spoken, even if that truth brings down the highest walls of power. Those lines rolled from lips like chants, like prayers, like promises. They were repeated in schools, in churches, and union halls. They appeared on murals and in graffiti scratched onto subway walls, projected onto courthouse facades at night. They became the new refrain of a nation clawing its way back to belief. And when history would look back, it would not see just a scandal about a contract. It would see the moment when America confronted its own reflection and asked if love itself could be bought, then what could never be. And the answer, fragile and defiant, came not from a contract, but from a truth no contract could cage. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.